Excellent. 3, 2, 1, go. Morning all. Thanks very much for joining us for season 2 of sorry. Right, let's
start over again. There we go.
Morning all. Thanks very much for joining us for season 2, episode 4 of Provision. For those who've tuned in before, welcome back. For the newbies, welcome. I'm BK from ProFounders, and I'm also joined by Sean, also from the ProFounders team. More importantly, we're very excited to be joined today by a very special guest, Greg Marsh. Greg left Index Ventures in 2009 to co-found onefinestay, a pioneering luxury hospitality business that lets travelers enjoy hotel-level service in beautiful homes while owners are out of town. Having raised over $80 million of venture funding over 4 different rounds, from VCs like Index and corporates like Hyatt, and scaled the team to over 700 across several international hubs, onefinestay was acquired by Accor Hotels in 2016. Greg joined the faculty of Harvard Business School as a senior lecturer, teaching the first-year MBA course on entrepreneurship, and was co-author of the 2017 Taylor Review of Modern Working Practice, commissioned by the British Prime Minister. Greg is currently a visiting professor at Imperial College Business School, a director of Amnesty International, and chairman of Lively, a London-based startup that's fixing the rental proposition. We're incredibly excited to have Greg on Provision. There are obviously a huge number of questions we could ask him about company building, given his wealth of experience as both a VC and a founder. As per usual, though, we'll be focusing solely on one topic today specifically. Today, that topic will be running a fundraising process. As before, we'll be limiting each answer to 90 seconds so we can get through more of your questions, and Sean will be able to join in with any sort of additional perspective he can add from the VC angle. So without further ado, I'll jump into some questions straight away. I guess in general, it would be a good way to introduce Greg. Anything that you want to say about the fundraising that you went through, the rounds, and a little bit of the potted story of onefinestay as a first kind of question, as an introduction to the audience.
I mean, I think you kind of said it, but I mean, we raised a bunch of money. It was a bumpy ride, it always is. There were some good bits and some bad bits. There were some good people and some bad people. Sean was a good person. He was on my board right from the start, and I was very happy to have him around, actually. But I don't know. I mean, I think, look, from a remove of 4 years now, they say nostalgia ain't what it used to be, but you remember the good bits and all the sleepless nights and the traumas. A bit like the early years parenting. You kind of gloss over those parts. Entrepreneurship's it's a blood sport. It's very hard work. But if the movie ends well, and not all movies end well, but if the movie ends well, everyone makes money, and you look back on it with rose-tinted glasses. While you're going through it, it ain't so much fun. But I'm not sure if I answered your question.
VK, I was going to say you almost forgot, from a ProFounders perspective, the most important part, which was that we were proud, happy investors in onefinestay. And as Greg touched on, I did have the privilege and pleasure of working alongside, although honestly, anytime a VC says that, it's quite disingenuous, because he was doing 99.99% of the work, and the VCs would show up kind of once every 6 weeks for an update from the company. It's a pleasure to have Greg here today, and there's going to be a lot more very intriguing questions about the process.
Got it. Cool. So I'll start then with a question from the audience, which kind of gets right into the meat of it, which was, you raised a seed round from VC funds such as Index. You also raised money from a corporate, Hyatt. Could you go into a little bit about the differences and the considerations when raising, I guess, from a corporate versus perhaps an institutional VC?
Yeah, it's honor among thieves, as they say. The challenge with raising money is that it's a pain in the butt. And it's a pain no matter who you raise it from. There are exceptions to that rule, like all rules. One occasionally meets founders who gone out there without even a slide deck on the back of a napkin and just raised $1 gazillion, but they are the exception. It's extraordinarily unusual, in the same way as it's extremely unusual, a la Zuckerberg, to retain control of your business while also making a ton of money. Most folks have to make hard decisions about what matters to them more. Is it about control or is it about wealth? So The better thing about VCs on balance is that you kind of know what butters their bread. You can usually predict their next move because they're basically motivated by dominant upside scenarios. And as long as you've got that clear, and once you realize that making 1 times or 2 times their money doesn't really matter very much to them, they'd almost kind of walk away or write off the investment if there's no realistic prospect of making 5 or 10 times their money or even more for a seed fund. Then you can predict their behavior, and that predictability makes it much easier to manage the relationship. The challenge with corporates is, Andreessen describes it as like trying to harpoon Moby Dick. You often just don't know what their real motivations are because they are gestalt. They have lots of different internally embedded incentives, and strategic alignment is much harder to ascertain. So it's that unpredictability and complexity that makes corporates a much more difficult elephant to dance with for a small business.
Can I get maybe not 90 seconds, but ask Greg a follow-up question to that? So Greg, you brought on board Hyatt, I think it was the Series D or E, I forgot the exact nomenclature, but it was quite late in the process. And you were able to, by that stage, kind of control some of the rights they might have requested for and create a real clear delineation between kind of the company and Hyatt itself. But would it have been possible at the early stage? Would you have taken their money at a Series A or Series B? Or was it only because you were at a Series D or E that you would even have considered it?
Yeah, the old adage is don't raise money from corporates until you know, and either until you're raising money from all of them at the same time, and therefore you're being crowned, the king or queen in your subsector, or until you have so much market power that you can control the terms of the raise. Because Hyatt's a good reference point here for us. That was we didn't announce that round. It was leaked, not by us, but it was leaked to a New York Times journalist or WSJ journalist who ran it. And when it was announced, every other hotel CEO in the market just assumed that we were sort of, I wouldn't say damaged goods, but we assumed that we were promised, right? In the sort of old-fashioned wedding sense of
the dowry had been sent over.
Well, that's right. And effectively, I remember my very first conversation with Sébastien Bazin, the CEO of Accor Hotels, who ultimately bought the business for a couple $100 million. His very first question was, aren't you already sort of halfway down the aisle with Hyatt? And the reality is the deal we'd done with Hyatt did not preclude us doing deals with other firms. And in fact, we'd intensively negotiated their ROFA, which was, really, really cut back. We'd negotiated their information rights. We'd done a bunch of stuff to insulate ourselves against the possibility of risk. But you do have to be really careful, because if other people think that you are no longer an investable proposition, or other folks in the market who you might need to partner with believe that you're no longer available, then you are no longer available, because perception is 90% of what matters. Yeah. Versus venture investors who are, forgive me, Sean, promiscuous, right? You can sort of shack up with all of them at the same time. It's more like an orgy than it is like a marriage.
Yeah. Although Rogan has definitely reminded us a lot on Provision that venture investing, hopefully the relationship is similar to a marriage, and hopefully the best ones are definitely like that. I guess on your point, Greg, there,
it's polyamory then, right? Because it's not, it's a very complicated marriage.
Aren't they all though? Aren't they all?
You actually, on that point there, on the exit to Accor Hotels, one of the questions here was, you had a successful exit to Accor, congrats. Was the kind of path to exit, or the potential to exit, part of your pitch at seed? And did you make it that early on, or is it something that kind of emerged much later?
No, we wanted to build a big business, and whether that culminated in we always envisaged it as an independent business, and a business that would stand on its own legs, and that might well have been how the story ended. As it happened, the story ended a bit earlier than that, because it was the right thing for the business and the right strategic option, and it kind of made sense for all parties. But I wouldn't say we engineered the business for exit, quite the opposite. I'd say we engineered the business to build a big business, and to build a good business that was a self-sustaining business. But there are always sort of other options that emerge on the course of your journey. For most of the company's duration, those options were a distraction, and then toward the latter phase of the company's development, it became increasingly clear to us actually that building the right kind of marketing partnerships and the right sort of distribution partnerships would accelerate the growth more effectively and more successfully than we could do as an independent company, unless we went out and raised $1 gazillion. And I suppose that was a viable strategic option in 2015, but it would have taken a major recommitment, not only from our investor group, but also from the management group. We're going to have to commit for another 5 to 10 years on that path. And we decided at that point that the right path was a partnership route, and then that partnership, naturally segued into an acquisition strategy.
And VK, from a VC perspective, if I see a Series A deck or in a meeting, if a founder spends an inordinate amount of time on an exit, I get quite worried. Honestly, I want them to be thinking about building a really massive business, and the exit takes care of themselves, right? What we try to say is, can you build a large standalone business here at the end of the day if you're successful? If so, there'll be plenty of options for investors and founders to sort of monetize the business personally.
Got it. So this one's a little bit about not a specific fundraising in terms of seed, but more across, seed, Series A, Series B, etc. Greg, in your experience, what's the difference between funding rounds in the sense that, how does the pitch change? Where does the focus inevitably shift over time? And where does the VC's focus shift as well?
Early stage investors, just to look at the economics of their fund, are looking to make a larger number of smaller bets with the hope that 1 or 2 of those will return many, many times money, 20 times money or more. If you're making 20 bets from a fund, then 1 or 2 of them might return 100x, and that will return the fund and make up for all the losses. Later stage investors archetypally are comfortable with making 2 to 3 times their money, but they really don't want to lose it ever. So it's a very different sort of place on that Pareto curve, and effectively going to different beta. From an entrepreneur's perspective, at the early stage, you have less data, you have more promise, but you have less fact. And so, and any professionally skeptical and intelligent investor discounts promise pretty heavily, because everyone thinks they're going to win, but not everyone will. And so things that you've actually achieved that I always talk about it's this way around, the curve that does that, which shows up into the right growth, is by far the strongest and most compelling argument for an institutional investor investing more than a million or 2, because unless you've demonstrated that, you probably haven't achieved product market fit, you probably haven't validated that the dogs want the proverbial dog food. And as the business grows up and scales, depending on the market that you're in, you're going to achieve more validation and historic proof points around scalability. And that's what investors want to see as the company grows up.
Yep. And then from a VC perspective, right, just to chime in here. So we are very early stage investors. We always have to work with our companies to get the next round of investment, sort of post our participation. And the pitch does change over time, right? In the early days, it's really about the vision. It's about the dream. It's about, to use the old marketing term from the 60s, it's about selling the sizzle, not selling the steak. And it's about the team and the market size. As the company progresses, it's much more about the delivery. It's about the numbers. It's about the metrics. And it's less about the overall dream, because you have to be able to deliver the proof points for that.
Right. So a question here, which I've heard a lot of people say, actually, should I always be raising? And I guess the question here is, are you always meant to be speaking to VCs? And did you always speak to VCs, or did you kind of hold them at bay and only talk to them when you were very much in fundraising mode? What's the best way to approach that kind of relationship?
I tended to approach it episodically and try to be fairly disciplined about having only brief, fairly perfunctory discussions with folks in between fundraising episodes. Just calling them episodes makes it sound like they're seizures, right? Which may actually be close to the reality. But I think that there's a sort of balance there. I wouldn't come out extreme on this spectrum. If a credible senior professional at a credible firm bumps into you at an event and says, "Hey, how's it going?" You'd be kind of crazy to turn your back on that person. On the other hand, what you might want to ration is what exact metrics and data you share. Bear in mind that typically you build those relationships over a series of conversations, and if you said, "Oh, it's going really well," by the way, it's always going well. That's always the first line, right? You're always crushing it in public, whatever the reality. But that first interaction, "Hey, actually, it's going really well. We've just achieved this, and within 12 months, we're going to achieve that." just have that ready in your back pocket. Then the next time you bump into them, maybe it is in a more formal environment. You can say, I remember I told you last April we were going to have launched in the US. Well, we did that actually 2 months ahead of plan. Okay, fine. So now you're building a time series indication of credibility because you're proving that you do what you say you're going to do. But the actual process of fundraising, when you're really in it and you really have to raise money, it is so all-consuming and so draining and so time-consuming that in most early-stage founding teams, it's a luxury that the chief exec cannot afford to spend all their time in that market. You think about a mature public company, and taking a bit longer than you'd like, but a mature public company is essentially raising money all the time. But look at the institutional apparatus that they have around the chief executive to be able to do that, right? They have an entire capital markets team under the CFO whose job it is to make the company able to raise money at all times and a live determined price. Whereas the process of doing that in a small business, creating liquidity, creating optionality around the deal event is extremely time consuming and basically just zaps most founding chief execs for 3 to 6 months. And that's time they're not spending on products and hiring and all the other stuff that actually creates value.
Yes, I've never once met an early stage company that has a head of investor relations, right? Where all the public companies do. Although maybe we create a new role within startups.
Got it. So I guess linked to that then, another question here in terms of deciding when to raise. Did you typically decide to raise based on sort of cash runway, or was it based on milestones that you said you wanted to achieve and then you achieved them and you wanted to raise, then get the next milestones? What was the main dictator of when you decided to do those episodes, as it were?
It's a triangulation function between sort of opportunity and need and sort of narrative, right? It might be moments in the narrative where it just feels like, wow, we just achieved something which is credible, or we need to go and do this specific thing. So when it came, for instance, to our Series B round, we were intending to launch in the US. And we therefore wanted an East Coast lead for our Series B fundraise. And we went out and found one. We talked to a couple of folks who were plausible, came and were great and lent in, and we enjoyed spending time with them. And they led, I think it was a $12 million Series B round. And so we had achieved a bunch of stuff in the UK, but we were raising on the promise of a US launch, and we then delivered on that US launch over the subsequent 12 months. So it made sense to do it then. I don't actually think our backs were against the wall for that fundraise, whereas the one after that, if memory serves, they were, right? We really did just have to raise money because I think it had been more expensive some than we expected. But again, this is sort of, I'm digging back into the recesses of my adult memory now.
Yeah, and generally the standard operating procedure, the timing question and the milestones question are quite aligned, because normally you raise for about 18 months. Generally takes you a year to prove something meaningful. That means you've got 6 months of cash left, and guess what? It's time then to start fundraising, because as Greg touched on, it's a 3-month best case scenario, 4, 5, 6 months at times to raise that next round.
Cool. So sort of broadly speaking, staying on the topic then, when you've decided, right, it's time to raise, the question here on the amount that, you should be pitching, should I pitch a smaller raise and hope it gets bigger if people are excited, or should I just pitch a larger amount and be okay if it ends up getting smaller?
I would turn it round a bit, because I think that puts tactics before strategy, and I think that strategy should determine the tactics. The way I think about it is, I go back to our Series B, right? We needed to launch a US operation. We felt that was absolutely strategically imperative to a travel business. We had to have transatlantic presence. We had a founder ready to relocate. So we were ready to do it, but we needed the capital to achieve it. And so we thought about, the question we asked ourselves was, within the spectrum of what could we plausibly raise, how much do we actually need with contingency and with coverage to be able to do this, allocate front and center energy to achieving this, while also running the business for 12 months or 18 months, whatever it was at the time. And that gave us an ask range. And then within that ask range, I don't know if it was 10 to 15 or whatever that number was, fine, you can then go out and say, we'd like to raise 15, and then maybe you get cut back to 12, or we're going to raise 10, and we go knocked up to 12. And I think sometimes entrepreneurs are steered in indicating on that range, not necessarily the tactics of it, right, rather than the strategy, which should come first. might be steered by, am I talking to a larger fund who kind of wants to deploy more capital, or am I talking to a smaller fund who's going to have to stretch to get there? And so you can probably shape your message a little bit fund to fund. But I do think it should start not from tactics, but from the strategy of how much do I need to prove the thing that's going to increase the value of my business by a factor of 5, because that's almost certainly the right way to come to the answer.
And what definitely doesn't work from our experience is going out with 2 drastically different plans, right? Where you say, okay, for smaller funds, we want to raise 5. If we speak to bigger funds, we'll raise 15. Because the reality is the world is small. People start chatting. Founders get confused about which plan they're pitching. It's just a mess, right? Because it's a very different business strategy, the way you talk about it. And so you need to do the right thing for the company, right? So the number one thing is to figure out what's the right amount of capital we need, and then plus or minus 10, 15%, and then you build from there.
Optionality is expensive. Real options cost. And if they don't cost cash, they cost distraction, and distraction is the biggest single risk for any small team. So I just want to double underline what Sean just said and say, have a plan. Throw yourself at it, right? Learn by trying. If it doesn't work, go back and rewrite a plan. But don't have 3 plans. It will kill you.
No, really solid advice. So more on the fundraising then. How do you maintain competitive tension in the round between VCs? I think it's probably a question that every kind of entrepreneur wants to get better at.
Yeah, it's really easy. All you have to do is simultaneously interest half a dozen tier 1 investors on the back of kind of compelling milestones, traction metrics, and a kick-ass story. Get them all to, the gatepost at exactly the same moment, and then shop the deal around. I don't see what's so hard about that.
As the meerkats say, simples.
No, I mean, obviously this is extraordinarily difficult, and a few rounds get bid up like that, and most folks have a much tougher time of it. Occasionally you get kind of 2-3 term sheets in play, and that's great. It's actually very difficult to do that. The best way to be able to do it is have a fantastic story, and the best way to have a great story is have a great business. So there's an awful lot of alignment with relatively sophisticated investors who have capital to deploy between having a great business and a great product and great traction and having a great fundraising process. I wouldn't say that it's always true. You might accidentally be in an unfashionable sector, and that's not your fault. And sometimes the unfashionability of the sector that you're operating in has nothing to do with the actual investment plausibility of that sector, because investors, bless them, are herd animals. And having said all that, you got to do the right thing by the business that you're building. You're probably smarter about it than anyone else in the world if you're any good. Your job is to try to find a way of telling the story to folks who are smart about deal making and smart about other things, but not smart about your business.
Got it. Cool. So a question here then, you mentioned sort of there, getting term sheets, etc. Have you repitched a VC, and perhaps, you may not, so you might not have much experience in this, but have you repitched a VC for the same fundraise when they'd said no before, after you'd got a term sheet? And what do you sort of think of that?
The difficulty is animal spirits, as Adam Smith called them. There is sort of there is natural momentum in discussions and deal making, and if someone sort of said, "Look, it's cool, but it's not for us," you think about the internal kind of emotional dynamics and the sociology of within a partnership who makes decisions. Like, we looked at that, we turned it down. What we're rationing as a partnership, an investment partnership, is we're rationing the scarce resource of our triage capacity. And so we've kind of looked at this and we turned it down. And our self-discipline is going to say, well, unless something has fundamentally changed, we're not going to relitigate this. Now, if something has fundamentally changed, and the thing that has fundamentally changed over the course of the last 3 weeks is, something that we didn't know, then fine. Or if it was a known unknown, that, regulatory approval or, patent endorsement or whatever, right? Then fine. If another shoe drops, then yeah, you'd be crazy not to reevaluate. If what you're asking is, look, we met someone, we pitched them, they turned us down. And then we met some other folks who were much more excited. And then we took it back to firm A because now there's momentum. Will firm A look at it again? And I'd say some firm A's will, because some firm A's are deal hounds and, they've got FOMO and all the rest of it. Should they? Probably not. Better run firms tend not to relitigate because they trust their judgment the first time. Less experienced, more junior, more anxious investors sometimes do pay too much attention to what they think that other people think that they think, etc. But generally speaking, I'd say you have a good shot. So ration your shots, pace yourself, and serialize your shots.
Just to chime in here, I think Greg summed it up very effectively. You're only playing on FOMO, right? If to go back, the only thing that's changed is, well, other people are in. Do you want to be into something that might be perceived as being hot now? The reality is, from a founder perspective, honestly, once VCs have made a decision, it's really hard to change their mind, right? When people come to us and say, ooh, someone else is in, frankly, it kind of looks pathetic. It's like, okay, well, then if you got them, why are you coming back to me? Great, you've got someone. Unfortunately, I've made up my mind. I'm probably wrong, because guess what? VCs are wrong all the time. But for us to change course is really tough. And frankly, from a founder perspective, it's a waste of your time. If you've got someone that's interested, spend the time and the resources and energy on getting them across the finish line, not trying to go back and take more meetings with people that were lukewarm on the idea.
Got it. So, I mean, I guess I'm extrapolating here from what you just said, but there was a question about repitching VCs that have said no in previous fundraisers. I would say that you would probably say, if something has materially changed, then do it.
Oh, different story. Because now you may actually have educated in the previous raise about why it was a potentially interesting business. There were a couple of significant kind of reservations they had, but hey, you've just proved that you can deliver on the thing that they were reserved about. Go back and hit them hard. Why not? They're already warm, or at least they understand what the story was. So we definitely did that, and I think that makes a ton of sense. But again, that conversation you could spool up quite late in a process, because the partner who met you last time kind of remembers the story. You're going to go back. Maybe you kept them up to date with progress on the path, and you hit them up at the last minute when you've already got a term sheet. Hey, listen. You'll remember we met 12 months ago. At that point, you guys weren't sure about our, international rollout. Over the last 12 months, we've launched in 3 countries and it's going really well. Here's the chart. We've actually got terms from another firm, but I really enjoyed our interactions last year. I would love to rekindle that discussion. Do you have any time this week to do that? They're going to take that meeting and they're going to know what to start with, and they're going to come to a very quick decision. So yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and VCs are simple creatures, right? So number one, we've heard the story before, so it makes it easier the second time around. And then to basically say, listen, this is how we've, these concerns you've had, and now we've fixed them or we've solved them. It's an easy conversation to have. It doesn't mean they'll get there, because there is no guarantee on it, but it's definitely an easy conversation to have. From a pro founder's perspective, VK, as you know, I wish we had more opportunity to do that, but we are quite early stage investors. And generally, if the business is doing well, it's kind of moved beyond us at the next stage. So it's one of those things. It's just a shame.
I'm going to interject a bit of founder cynicism, which I think is justified, which is that venture capitalists have to spend a lot of their lives. I've done this gig for a couple of times in a couple of funds, and spend a lot of time saying no. And saying no is unpleasant. It makes us feel hollow and empty as human beings, and we gradually become husks of our former selves. And so what we generally do as investors, partly because we hate saying no, and partly because we want to retain some goodwill in the relationship in case there is a future opportunity to invest on better terms or on different terms, is we generally say not yet. And that soft signaling or that soft peddling of a negative message can often be misconstrued by perennially optimistic founders. So what they hear is, I love this, but I just can't quite get my partners there. Or I love this, but we just need to see X. Whereas what they're actually saying or thinking is, never in a month of Sundays am I backing you, I hate your shirt. Now, the difficulty from a founder's perspective is you often can't tell the difference between those two messages, because a good investor masks the difference between those two messages. And that makes it hard to know whether it is worth returning that phone call and going back to the investor who passed a year ago or not.
But that's why, Greg, actually going quite late in the process is a good idea, right?
Go late in the process.
The people that are interested, you basically have a forcing function, and you make the conversations just very quick.
Cool. So one here on the actual pitching the business itself. The question here is, do you have any advice for discussing the parts of the business that remain unproven or still unknown? Do you spend a very short amount of period of time focusing on them, or do you actually spend a significant amount of time acknowledging that they're unknown?
It depends on your audience a bit. There are some investors who temperamentally are quite kind of analytic, reductive, cerebral types, and they kind of like having their attention drawn to the uncertainties. There are some who are more momentum investors, and they're more sort of naturally motivated by their animal spirits. And in those cases, I think dwelling on complexity, subtlety, or indeterminacy is going to turn them off. So I'd say a little bit of that is the theater of figuring out the temperament of the person you're pitching to or the room that you're walking into, figuratively or literally. And I'd also say that my personal bias is to be quite rigorously analytical about these things. So I do tend to know what the unknowns are, but I won't always tell you. That's kind of your job as an investor, right? I'll know what the real risks are, and I'll be acutely aware of some of them, and I will tell you about some of them, but I'm probably not going to tell you what my biggest risks are if I think they're existential, if I actually want you to invest. It's your job to figure it out, up to a point.
Yeah, I was harking back, Greg, to, do you remember Donald Rumsfeld, who was, I think, Secretary of Defense in the U.S.? He said there are no knowns, unknown unknowns, unknown knowns, and known unknowns. And it's quite a confusing statement, but clearly the known knowns everyone needs to know, and the unknown unknowns, who the heck knows? The difference, I think, in founders, from our perspective, is whether they can think through the known unknowns or the unknown knowns. So there might be things that you know are questions that you have to answer. You don't have the answer yet, but as long as you've thought through them and you acknowledge them, that's great. I think when we pose a question to a founder and they act like they've never thought about that, that's really scary, because you know your business way better than we do. And if we can, after 45 minutes, come up with a question that stumps you that you haven't thought about, that's quite scary.
Right. So perhaps, given timing, maybe the last question here, and I guess this is one that a lot of founders grapple with towards the end of the process. How did you go about performing sort of due diligence on the investors? Was it going to the portfolio companies, or did you do something slightly different?
Yeah, I think so first thing is you didn't ask, should you? And the answer is yeah, hell yeah. It's easier to divorce a spouse of a decade than it is to kick an investor you don't like off your board. You have almost no ability to do that. And if that relationship, if the personal dynamics and the chemistry of that relationship sours, or if that investor leaves the firm and orphans your deal within the fund, it can cause irreparable harm to a company's prospects. I've seen this on both sides of the table a bunch of times, and it's very hard to fix. You can't completely diligence out that risk, but you can certainly assess it. And one way you can do that is meet multiple folks within the firm. Another way you can do it is talk to people who've worked with that investor as a board member in multiple different scenarios. A third way you can do it is via the investor. I would like you to introduce me to a couple of folks who've worked with you who really enjoyed it. And I'd also like you to introduce me to a couple of folks whose businesses failed on your watch. And push them hard for that. And any good investor will be willing to do that, and they'll understand what you're asking and why. And if they get all tight-lipped, then as with any referencing exercise, you're kind of learning something. It's remarkably hard to walk away from a deal as a founder, especially if it's the only term sheet you've got on offer, when you get negative signals about an investor. But it might nevertheless be the right thing to do if you can afford to. If you can't afford to walk away, then you have a hard choice. But hey, entrepreneurship's about hard choices, right?
Yes, indeed. Cool. So, Greg, we've asked quite a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we're running on time. There are still a few left, but we won't be able to get through all of them. Greg, thank you very much for taking the time to chat to us about some of these. These questions have come from the community, and I'm sure they're incredibly grateful for you for answering them and giving your perspective, giving your experience both as VC, but then as a founder. So yeah, I can't thank you enough. Thanks very much. Happy
to help. Happy holidays, everyone, and thanks, ProFounders, for the dust up of a sunny morning.
Thanks, everyone. That was Greg Marsh, and that's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. As always, this video will make its way onto YouTube and the ProVision community resource on Notion. Feel free to check it out. Hopefully, it is helpful. We'll be taking a hiatus over Christmas and be back in the new year. We're wishing you all a safe and merry Christmas and winter break and a happy new year. Stay tuned for more.